guys, Tim Freitas of the Garden of English here, and today we're going to get into part 2 of annotations. If you haven't watched the part 1 video, I encourage you to do that before you get to part 2, but it doesn't really matter. We're trying to teach kids to annotate texts, annotate them purposefully, so that we don't have to tell kids to annotate them and then they come in with an entire sheet that's highlighted because, of course, everything the author said and did was important. What we're trying to do with the annotation method that I'm presenting right here is we're trying to set kids up for their rhetorical analysis essay. We're trying to give them annotations that will help them better identify what authors are doing and what the purpose of what they're doing actually entails and the function of the argument. So the last time that I produced a video, we talked about how I encourage students to annotate down the left-hand side of the page with rhetorical modes or methods of development, as they're commonly called. And today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what they should put down the right-hand side of the page, which will be elements of the classical argument structure, otherwise known as the oration model. Now, before we get into this, I am going to just shrink myself over here so that you can see the document that I'm working with, which is linked down below, and it's also found in the last video as well. We're going to try to keep myself as much out of the way as possible. The first annotations that kids do, once again, on the left-hand side, can be found right here. These 8 points here, I just go over those with the kids, and then they look for examples of what these methods of development entail in a text, and we annotate that. But down the right-hand side of the text, I'm going to use the 6-part oration structure, also known as the classical model. And you'll see here in the document, and I'll highlight this, is it says this is the reason why we're going to annotate this down the right-hand side is because this deals with the why factor. Why is the author doing what they're doing at this area of the text? I chose the 6-part oration model for these annotations because every argument that you'll ever see has these parts. They're not necessarily always in this order, but they pretty much exist in almost every single element that argument that you see. I typically like to start my annotation process using the intro to Fast Food Nation, because the intro to Fast Food Nation follows the oration structure almost to a T. But every once in a while, you will notice that there are a couple elements that fit the characteristics of exordium that show up after the very beginning of the piece, and sometimes we see a little bit of a partition later on in the piece. And the refutation isn't only right before the end. So what I do is I tell kids, we're going to look at what these parts mean, and then we're going to read arguments and say, okay, what matches up with these parts, but they're not necessarily in this order. Now, is it true that most arguments do start with some sort of an exordium and end with some sort of a so what? Absolutely. In fact, most of the time we do go from an exordium to a background information to a partition, and then they typically do end with a so what, and the confirmation and refutation kind of fluctuate in between. But it doesn't matter. We want to say, hey, look, here are the parts of an argument that are pretty standard, and then we want kids to try to find these parts, because if they can find these parts, they'll know why the author is doing what they are doing. Now, I was in Texas this last summer, and when I mentioned that I used the classical structure or the oration model, one of my participants in my APSIs said, I just Google searched that, and we have a 4-part classical model, a 5-part classical model, a 6-part classical model. He said, what makes you so sure that the 6-part model is the best? And I actually gave him 2 words, and I said David Jolliffe, who, if you don't know, he's basically the Gandalf of rhetoric in the country, and he is actually a friend of mine who I have deep, immense respect for. So when I sat through my sessions with David and he was like, hey, we're going to talk about the 6-part oration, since that day I have adopted the 6-part oration. So anyway, the last time that we spoke, I was using he showed us the Way article that did show up on the 2015 AP Lang exam. It's by Cesar Chavez. We're going to continue to use that today just so I can model what it looks like to annotate down the right-hand side of the document so that we can have purposeful annotations for kids. And then what I'll do is I'll do the exact same thing I did last time when I said, okay, if we annotate in this way, can we give kids purposeful rhetorical strategies or purposeful rhetorical function statements that can help us to articulate really strong topic sentences. So anyway, with that being said, I'm going to just go over the classical model here real quick, what the components are, because we want kids to be looking for these elements as they read. So I start with the web, which is the exordium, and this is where in some way the argument is trying to engage the audience. So the speaker is purposely trying to provoke something, or entice the audience, or shock the audience, or just get them involved in some way. Typically after there's a moment of shock or getting involved, or just promoting a sense of intrigue, it shifts to background information, which works to contextualize why we're even talking about what we're talking about. In this background information, a lot of times we start seeing collective views being presented, and the views of other people. And that's typically followed by what we call the partition, which is where the speaker begins to, or the writer begins to separate from the background information and the context and say, here's what I want to focus on, and really try to argue in my piece. Once that shows up, we then have the writer's thesis present there, and that can be one sentence, that could be multiple sentences. It doesn't also have to show up at the end of the first paragraph. I know we teach our students that, but in really good writing, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it can be, over the length of a paragraph, but that's okay. Once we see that partition, we now know if this is what the writer is going to argue, then the rest of the paper is either going to confirm with evidence that argument, or try to refute other people's evidence, and then explain why all of this matters. And that's, of course, what happens with the rest of the classical model. After the partition, typically a confirmation follows, and that's going to be the majority of the argument. So, hey, let's confirm my point of view. Let's confirm my argument with evidence and reasoning. That's then followed by an element of refutation, which not every argument has, although it is strong to have it, because it at least allows the other side to see that you have thought about their points of view. And last but not least, of course, we finish with the so what, which is really just this idea of what does this have to do with universal implications in the real world? Why should we care about this? And then why should we apply this reading to our own lives if I'm actually in the audience? Or why should I listen to this speech and then change my behavior if I'm in the audience? So we want to just define those things for the students. We want to define those things for ourselves and go over our reading and say, okay, what elements do indeed fit? So without further ado, let's scroll down here, and we are going to scroll past this page because this has a couple more steps I have for annotations in here. And we're going to pull up the He Showed Us the Way. Now, what's nice about doing it this way is we're going to look down the right-hand side of the page today. So we're going to focus over here. And if we do this, when we take care of finding elements of the oration model, it's much easier than if we are looking for the methods of development, also known as the rhetorical modes. And the reason why is because although sometimes there is a blurring of the parts, it's not as, it's just much easier to tell the parts apart, even though sometimes they do share some text here. So let's actually look at this. I'm going to annotate this with my stylus on my tablet here, so please forgive me when things get a little messy and whatnot, but we're going to go through here. I'm going to annotate it with you down the right-hand side, and if we were to pair the annotations from the last video down the left-hand side with the annotations from this video down the right-hand side, you will be able to create delightful topic sentences that can help you write through a rhetorical analysis. So here we go. We're going to start reading. Let me just make sure that I'm not blocking the text here with my ugly mug. So here we go. As I read, I want to start talking about why I'm breaking different parts up. We're going to call the web the exordium. I'm not going to label that with a W. I'm going to label that with an EX. Now, if some of you are like, oh, that's going to confuse my kids because we have exemplification on the left-hand side for rhetorical mode, then just use a W. That's fine as well. But first paragraph, here we go. In honoring Martin Luther King Jr.'s memory, we also acknowledge nonviolence as a truly powerful weapon to achieve equality and liberation. In fact, the only weapon that Christians who struggle for social change can claim as their own. Now, what's nice here is that although we do at the very end here have a showcase of what his argument is, essentially going to be, this is actually going to function pretty well as an exordium. And the reason why is because what we're doing is he's starting to engage his audience that he knows is made of poor working folks that care about civil rights. He's going to engage them by mentioning Martin Luther King Jr. He also recognizes that we're talking about his memory, so we're getting a little bit of background in here. And he's talking about acknowledging that. So this right here is kind of collectively engaging the audience of, hey, let's get this religious figure on our mind so that we can think about what we're about, and then we're going to start shifting into the argument at hand. So we start with the exordium here, and then if we start to scroll down, let me just exit out of my notes here. Okay. If we start to scroll down, it says Dr. King's entire life was an example of the power that nonviolence brings to bear in the real world. Now, this is a great little moment here because all I have to do is say, okay, his entire life was that. So we're giving some background here. Hey, this guy existed, and it's a good thing. Okay. And you're going to notice here, it says, it's an example that inspired much of the philosophy and strategy of the farm workers movement. And what's really nice about here is I'm going to mark this for our kids because what's happening is this is a great example of where the partition kind of shows up, because what's happening is he's now equating the farm workers movement and Dr. Martin Luther King. So we see we're getting people connected with this figure. We then have some background information. Hey, his life was this way. And now we have that the philosophy inspired the strategy of the farm workers movement. And so this is where we actually start to see a bit of that partition. So we see a separation there. So my kids are just going to label this as, oh, we got some background here. This is going to be part of the partition. And then it says this observance of Dr. King's death. Okay, so notice we're back to a little bit of background here. All right, and that's okay because things do overlap. So they might draw a little arrow. Oh, that's background. Gives us the best possible opportunity to recall the principles which our struggle has grown and matured. And so now we know exactly why all of this is going on. So we see a mixture of background and partition right here. And then we finally start to shift to the thesis of the piece, which is nice here because we can actually teach our kids that a thesis does not have to actually be one sentence. We know that part of what goes on up at the top highlights the argument, but what he's going to argue throughout the paper actually shows up after he begins to segue into the farm workers movement. And it starts here. It says, our conviction is that human life is a very special possession given by God to man, and that no one has the right to take it for any reason or any cause, however just it may be. If we resort to violence, I skipped a section, right? We are also convinced that nonviolence is more powerful than violence. Nonviolence supports you if you have a just and moral cause. Nonviolence provides the opportunity to stay on the offensive, and that's of crucial importance to win any contest. And so sure enough here, with my students, I am going to just bracket this off right here, and I'm going to just label this, although it is considered part of the partition, this is really the thesis of the piece. Okay? So they're going to see how the exordium flows into the background and then to the partition and then to the thesis. It's important that although we're marking these parts, we showcase to kids that these kind of flow into each other, because once again, if kids think about these things only as boxes, then they're going to conceptualize arguments as being jumpy movements. And that's not what an argument is. A well-organized argument that has a consistent line of reasoning with positive evidence is going to flow nicely. So we're going to be able to say, oh, we see him leaving this particular moment in the argument structure and then flowing into the next. So when we see a little bit of a mixture up top here of background, yet also exordium because it's getting people involved, that's okay. And we want kids to recognize that too. Okay? So anyway, we see our thesis here, and I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. Let's make sure we're not blocking our stuff with my face. And now what we're going to do is we're going to start trying to say, okay, if we've already taken care of the web, if we've already taken care of the background, if we've already seen the thesis, that means the majority of what's going to come next is either going to be refutation or confirmation, or maybe even a little bit of both. We might see some subclaims show up, so some new partitions. But with this piece, I chose this one because it follows the classical model pretty well. We'll see a little bit of refutation tossed in before the end, maybe where the confirmation typically is, but that's okay. We want to show kids that these are versatile movements here. So anyway, as we continue, it says, if we resort to violence, then one of two things will happen. Either the violence will be escalated and there will be many injuries and perhaps deaths on both sides, or there will be total demoralization of the workers. And so sure enough, right here, I asked my kids, what does this tell us about nonviolence? And they suggest to me that violence is not going to work, so it implies that nonviolence will. And I'm like, good, so how does that function in the argument? They'll just write a little CON for confirmation. Then it says here, nonviolence has exactly the opposite effect. If for every violent act committed against us, we respond with nonviolence, we attract people's support. We can gather the support of millions who have a conscience and would rather see a nonviolent resolution of problems. We are convinced that when people are faced with a direct appeal from the poor struggling nonviolently against great odds, that they will react positively. The American people and people everywhere still yearn for justice, and it is to that yearning that we appeal. Once again, if we go back to that thesis, I ask kids, where does this fit in relation to the thesis? They will very easily tell you, oh, confirmation. Now, what's nice here is that whatever they label on the left-hand side for rhetorical modes or methods of development, we can now write a sentence. Oh, if he contrasts the outcomes or the positive outcomes of nonviolence with the negative outcomes of violence, well, he does that in order to, all right, what's he confirming? Oh, the power of nonviolence. I now have a great topic sentence. He contrasts the outcomes of both violence and both violence and nonviolence in order to highlight the power that nonviolence holds, because that's what he's confirming over on this side. And that's going to lead to a really strong topic sentence when they put their evidence in, and then we say, okay, how does that confirm the power of nonviolence? Anyway, as we continue here, it says, but if we are committed to nonviolence, so we're going to be back right here, I'm sorry for interrupting, but if we are committed to nonviolence only as a strategy or tactic, then if it fails, our alternative is to turn to violence. Now, what's really nice about this little moment here is that he's anticipating almost an element of refutation here. He's anticipating that some people are saying, well, it can be a strategy or a tactic, but not our whole plan. And he's like, no, we can't do that. We have to make sure that we highlight that nonviolence is the only way. It's not a strategy or tactic. It's the only way we do things. So this right here fits into qualities of trying to embrace a counter argument. And so sure enough, he comes back and he says, so we must balance the strategy with a clear understanding of what we're doing. However important the struggle is, and however much misery, poverty, and exploitation exist, we know that it cannot be more important than human life. And so sure enough, he's just trying to highlight here some people might be going through misery, poverty, and exploitation, but then he goes back to confirming why nonviolence is indeed much better, because it's not more important than acting violently is not more important than a human life. It says, we work on the theory that men and women who are truly concerned about people are nonviolent by nature. These people become violent when the deep concern they have for people is frustrated and when they are faced with seemingly insurmountable odds. So you'll notice he confirms here why nonviolence is much more powerful because you're much more human. But then sure enough, he does indeed recognize, the moment of people that might disagree with him, because they are indeed frustrated. But as he empathizes with them, he's working to then change them by showcasing the power of nonviolence all the more. And we see that in the next paragraph. It says, we advocate militant nonviolence as our means of achieving justice for our people. That's great. And it says, but we are not blind to the feelings of frustration, impatience, and anger which seethe in every farm worker. The burdens of generations of poverty and powerlessness lie heavy in the fields of America. If we fail, there are those who will see violence as a shortcut to change. Once again, we're trying to embrace the idea that there are people that are going to potentially not agree with him because they're too frustrated, but sure enough, he's trying to address that right now. So he already had spoken about, didn't mean to do that, he already had spoken about the benefits of nonviolence, and now he's trying to address those that might continue to want to move violently here. And now what we're going to do is he's going to now work to prove that wrong. So we know this is a refutation because he is going to provide the idea why this is wrong and how to actually overcome those feelings. And we'll see that in the next paragraph. So it says here, it is precisely to overcome these frustrations that we have involved masses of people in their own struggle throughout the movement. Freedom is best expressed through the participation and self-determination of many, and free men and women instinctively prefer democratic change to any other means. Sure enough, right? He's addressing these counter-arguments, and in doing so, he's confirming his stance that there's more power in nonviolence. Thus, demonstrations and marches, strikes and boycotts are not only weapons against the growers, but our way of avoiding the senseless violence that brings no honor to any class or community. The boycott, as Gandhi taught, is the most nearly perfect instrument of nonviolent change, allowing masses of people to participate actively in a cause. Once again, we see this paragraph fitting in just nicely, supporting the nonviolent action. As we continue, right? When the victory comes through violence, it is victory with strings attached. If we beat the growers at the expense of violence, victory would come at the expense of injury and perhaps death. Such a thing would have a tremendous impact on us. We would lose our regard for human beings. Then the struggle would become a mechanical thing. When you lose your sense of life and justice, you lose your strength. Sure enough, confirming why nonviolence is better. So we'll mark that right there. Now, as I scroll down, you're going to notice that a majority of this is indeed actually confirmation. And that's because when we make arguments, we try to confirm our arguments as best we can and as often as we can in order to highlight why essentially we are indeed right. Now, we'll keep reading and then we'll try to see when we shift to the so what. So please note once again that the refutation didn't come right before the end. That's why we want to show kids that the oration structure is about having parts of an argument, not necessarily in that order, though many of them do show up in that order. But starting right here, it says, the greater the oppression, the more leverage nonviolence holds. Violence does not work in the long run, and if it is temporarily successful, it replaces one violent form of power with another just as violent. People suffer from violence. Examine history. Who gets killed in the case of violent revolution? The poor and the workers. The people of the land are the ones who give their bodies and don't really gain much for it. We believe it's too big a price to pay for not getting anything. Those who espouse violence exploit people. To call men to arms with many promises and ask them to give up their lives for a cause and then not produce for them afterwards is the most vicious type of oppression. So sure enough, we see more confirmation here. However, I want to just make a little side note. This is where we want to show kids about when they create arguments, why they want to use concrete evidence as specific as possible. Particularly this paragraph here that starts with examine history, and it says who gets killed in the case of a violent revolution. Notice how he doesn't give actual concrete examples. It's important that he doesn't, because if we could think of even the violent revolutions that we've seen, they might actually suggest the opposite of this. Think about what happened in 1776, and now we actually have contemporary democracy. But anyway, end of my side note here. What we're going to notice is that when we get to the end here, the kids are going to be looking for, all right, when does this switch from the confirmation to the so what? And the so what is the, okay, what do you need to do, or why is this universal, or how do we handle this from here on out? If the people are indeed in with this idea that nonviolence is effective, right, because he's confirmed it throughout the whole piece, when we get to this next section here, we are going to start with our so what. And here's why. Let's read it, and we'll see what people are able to do. It says, we know that most likely we are not going to do anything else the rest of our lives except build our union. For us, there is nowhere else to go. Although we would like to see victory come soon, we are willing to wait. In this sense, time is our ally. We learned many years ago that the rich may have money, but the poor have time. Now, the so what here is great, because kids might be able to say, okay, here's our so what, and then I just say, okay, well, what is he actually doing for these people now? How do they feel now? And how are they moved? And they're like, oh my gosh, these poor people, or those that are being oppressed, feel like they actually have power. And we see that when we get to this last part where it says that the rich may have money, but the poor have time. So they're empowered. And then as we go back to the very end here, it says, it's been our experience that few men or women have ever had the opportunity to know the true satisfaction that comes from giving one's life totally in a nonviolent struggle for justice. And notice this idea of true satisfaction. It says Martin Luther King Jr. was one of those unique servants, and from him we learned many of the lessons that have guided us. For these lessons and for his sacrifice for the poor and oppressed, Dr. King's memory will be cherished in the hearts of the farm workers forever. And so what's our so what here? Our so what is that we can do this and we can actually cherish his memory. And who wouldn't want to do that if they actually are part of the farm workers movement and care about the nature of civil rights? So at the very end here, it's very, very audience focused about what they can do here on out now that they know that nonviolence is indeed more powerful than violence. So you'll notice I'm going to scroll up here, and all it does is I just have exordium in background, partition, thesis, and then where is the thesis confirmed? Where does he engage with people that might think differently than him? And then he goes back to supporting, and we're left with our so what. Now, this is all nice for kids because what happens is if they know the qualities of these moments here, I can then say, okay, if you're going to write a topic sentence and say the author is doing something on this side, you're going to put the words in order to in the middle, and then you're going to answer why on the next side. Now, if an exordium is meant to intrigue or engage the audience, I guess kids could write, oh, he begins by, evoking the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in order to engage the audience. But that's not really saying much. We want to get kids to say, okay, I know the exordium is to engage the audience, but I'm going to then ask the question, well, how does this engage the audience? Oh, well, it brings out inspirational feelings towards a national icon. And I'm like, good. Okay, now look at your topic sentence. He evokes the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in order to inspire the audience to espouse what he believed in. Oh, that is a great topic sentence to begin with. And all I'm doing is asking a couple questions, right? When they find the background, I'll just say, okay, so he does this in order to, and I'll say, what's the background meant to do here? Is the background meant to highlight injustice? Is the background meant to, compare something? What's going on here? Okay, and as they work through the movements of the oration structure, I'll always ask a question. What's being actually confirmed here? Don't just say to confirm his argument. Well, what part of his argument is being confirmed? And that's what they're going to have to articulate in their topic sentences. Now, although this is typically my why side, if I go down this right-hand side, this is the why side of a topic sentence that I'll have kids write. You can also use these annotations here to label rhetorical choices as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go through and I'm going to read off what I labeled these as. Now, you're going to notice that the verbs that I've chosen are indeed matched with this list right here. So if kids can find the exordium in the background, they can just remember these verbs, and these are how we can start labeling our strategies. Or these are the verbs we can put on the other side of in order to, if that's what you require of their topic sentences. So as I go through the different parts of the piece, I'll just say what he's doing, and we'll turn these moments even over here into rhetorical choices as well. So they don't always have to just be the why part of the topic sentence. You can also turn them into rhetorical choices. So up at the beginning, I have that Chavez initiates inspirational feelings for a national and religious icon. When we get into our background, I have that he segues into comparing the success of the civil rights movement with the farm workers' cause. And then that also can fit with our partition element here too. When it comes to the thesis, I have he presents the value and dignity of human life. And just think about this. We could say he does blankety blank in order to present the value and dignity of human life. So right here, he kind of defines the philosophy of the movement. Our conviction is that human life is a very special gift given by God. All right, so if he's defining the overall philosophy of the movement, he does that in order to present the value and dignity of human life. That's why this can work into a great topic sentence here. But as we continue, if we start with this first part, I'm I can say in his confirmation, he does this in order to legitimize the positive outcomes of nonviolent protest. When we get into this part down here, where we have refutation, I could say he refutes those who are frustrated with nonviolent action in this part of the text. As we continue, when we look at this part about frustrations in elements of refutation, I can just say that he confirms the negative oppressive nature of these violent tactics, and we actually see that down here as well. And then when we get to the end in the so what, he clarifies the power of the less fortunate down here, and he implies the overall success of the movement down here as well. And so I just made these little statements here for you all, because those statements can work as rhetorical choices, or they can work as the why does this stuff happen in a topic sentence. So nonetheless, as I scroll down here, you'll notice that each one of the things that I just said follows the pattern of our annotations, and I just chose verbs from this list here, so that when my kids write their topic sentences, they typically say, oh, he does something from over here in order to, and then they put a verb based on where it functions here. Now, what's also nice about these annotations is that if you look in the document that I've provided for you, this comes from the 1996 exam from the College Board, but you'll notice that if you were to annotate this with rhetorical mode down one side and oration structure down the other, you can actually, and I've already done this for you, I've matched these to the questions and answers, but you can find that these annotations touch upon almost every single question that's in here. And besides the fact that some of these deal with rhetorical devices that are not going to be questioned on the exam so much anymore, the questions themselves that are rhetorically analytical in nature are very similar to exam questions that still exist. So these annotations can help kids either go through stems or find the right answer. I mean, even look at number 1 here. It says the first paragraph of the passage serves to, and look at it, it says genius or originality is, and then he defines it. Well, the correct answer is B, and the word definition is right there. So these annotations do indeed help for multiple choice as well. On top of that, though, I am going to scroll down here to just show you one last thing. I mentioned this in the last video, but if you look, this is just an organizer, and if the kids are marking the method of development based on a section of text, they then can just check the box to where it fits. And now they can know why this piece actually is in the argument itself, or why this text is. So the way that I use this little organizer here is if the kids separate the text into 5 sections, they're going to actually fill out this organizer 5 times. And I'll have them summarize the text right here. And then I'll say, great, what methods of development are used? And then I'll say, where does it fit down this little checklist right here? And wherever they check, I'll then say, okay, great, let's use this here and this here to create topic sentences. And we'll try to pick verbs. And once again, and I'll put this right underneath, but my typical format for a topic sentence for, moving the wrong thing here. My typical format for a topic sentence, just to begin with, is going to be the speaker insert verb and then label the choice in order to, and then they have to explain why. So if you have any questions, comments, and or fashion tips, put them in the comments below. By the way, I think I'm about 30 subscribers below 200. So I encourage you to subscribe, because once we hit 200, I'm going to give away a free Garden of English t-shirt. Not this one, by the way. I'll give away the one that I showed last week. But on top of that, if you desired that you want a Garden of English t-shirt and you don't want to wait for the giveaway because, well, you just want one, there is a link down there for that as well. So once again, as always, please subscribe. Leave a comment, by the way, because the only people that are eligible to actually win the t-shirt are those that leave a comment, even if it's just a, hey, I want to try to get the t-shirt. That's cool, too. If you have any questions for me, put them down below. Also, as you saw in a video from last week, I am hanging out with Brandon Abden and Lauren Peterson a little bit. And if you have any questions that you want me to ask them, you can put those in the comments down below as well. And I will try to see if I can get them, rope them into doing another video with me where we can address those as well. So anyway, be well, enjoy. Hopefully you enjoyed your Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And we'll be back probably in about a week or two to talk about thesis statements for rhetorical analysis. And then after that, we'll go into body paragraphing and conclusion. So we'll go there. Also, just so you know, after rhetorical analysis is done, we'll start looking at avenues to synthesis, probably around the early March, maybe mid-March. We'll see, depending on time. Anyway, you all have a great one.